Okay. Welcome everybody, both here and on the Zoom. Last time I looked at the Zoom, there were about 12 or 13. Plus we had one person from overseas, our international visitor. I'm your MC my name is Dennis Doherty, I'm your MC for today. Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were dropped by the USA 80 years ago. The campaign to ban nuclear weapons started right then. And has taken many forms, but the form that's most enduring is, and the one that resonates down the ages, is Hiroshima, Nagasaki, never again. Nuclear weapons should never be used again. We say no country should have nuclear weapons, and we do not countenance any exceptions. The US, China, Russia, UK, France, the DPRK, Pakistan and India, and Israel should not have nuclear weapons. I hope I haven't left anyone out, did I? Sorry? Okay. We say to Australia that Australia should sign the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, otherwise known as the TPNW. In a few days' time, on the 15th of August, there will be celebrations to mark the end of the war against Japan or the victory in the Pacific. There may be some congratulations and pattings on the back while the military have a field day. The RSL will be prominent and so on. Reflections on the contribution of past service of servicemen who gave so much for peace will be remembered. But the element of how we stop the next one will be lost. Furthermore, the current wars have the potential to swing out of control and end up with a nuclear exchange. So much so that the atomic scientists who control what's called the doomsday clock, the clock that strikes midnight when the world is about to go under, they have put the clock at 89 seconds. 89 seconds to midnight. The end of World War II did not signal the end of war. Even today, we are witnessing the most abject massacre and the use of several times the explosives used in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And I'm talking about Gaza. The scenes of Gaza now look like what Hiroshima and Nagasaki did after the bombs were dropped. Hence, we have called the conference 89 seconds to midnight, but we're not here to wring out our hands, but to understand and to work for peace out of this debacle created by the likes of Trump and his sycophants. You can see the outline of today's program. We plan a large amount of time for discussion, so please save your questions for the end of the talks. You can see that the first speaker, Ruth, then followed by Vince, and then we have an international speaker from the United Kingdom, and then question and answer, and then conclusion. But more about that as we go through the afternoon. This event being 80 years is special. So the Hiroshima Day Committee and the Muslim Collective planned 3 events, and this is the last of the 3. So but before I do that, I had to remind you that you know where the toilets are, and you know the fire escapes are out that way. So, hopefully. So hopefully there won't be any need for those. So, and, whoops, wrong one. All right, and there were the three events. We had a march, we've had an exhibition, and this is the conference. We'll talk about those later. Now I'd like to introduce Ruth. Now, there is her CV. Ruth is a medical doctor, and you can see her CV there. She's part of the great organisation called ICANN. She was a co-chair, and she's also part of Medical Practitioners for the Prevention of War. Please welcome Ruth to the mic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here with you today. And something that I don't take lightly is an opportunity to speak to those who are deeply concerned about commemorating and moving forward from what happened 80 years ago. I want to begin by acknowledging that we meet on unceded sovereign Aboriginal land, the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I want to acknowledge that this land was never ceded, that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And I also want to acknowledge that wherever they've been tested, nuclear weapons have disproportionately affected Indigenous communities. And that is something which we must sit with and bear witness to. As was mentioned, I'm part of ICANN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And on this, the week of the 80th anniversaries of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I wanted to reflect on some of the history of the movement that I'm so fortunate to be a part of, and which I know that so many of you are as well. For me, the injustice of nuclear weapons was obvious to me as soon as I found out about them. I remember at the age of 11 discovering what had happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and being alarmed and outraged. And then to realize that such a destructive force hadn't been gotten rid of, but in fact had been amplified, was being renewed in many countries, and that others wished to acquire nuclear weapons was horrifying to me as a young, burgeoning, angry preteen. As a medical student, I started out a journey where I didn't really quite feel at home amongst my peers. I was surrounded by people who'd come from the sort of background where they'd come to medicine and were hoping to aspire to a certain sort of lifestyle. They had ambitions and aspirations for their lives, and how their profession was going to fit into that really didn't resonate with me at all. I went to med school so we could change the world. I really wanted to shift the dial on some difficult problems, and I wasn't kind of feeling that vibe from many of my classmates, but I was very fortunate that I received an email from the great Ian Maddox, who is a doyen of palliative care medicine and one of the people who was at the very beginning of the journey of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War and the Medical Association for the Prevention of War, which is the Australian affiliate of that. And in addition to starting, medical schools in Papua New Guinea and bridging the gap for delivery of critical palliative care services in many locations around the world, he has worked for peace and against nuclear weapons for a long time. And he wrote this email and he sent it to all the medical students. And I have never responded to an email so fast in all my days as the one which said, "Hey, would anyone like some funding to go to a congress in Beijing of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War?" And I had this feeling like something's about to change for me. And so I went to this congress and I met doctors and medical students from around the world who cared deeply, deeply about a world bristling with nuclear weapons. That was in 2004, the Beijing Congress. That was my first year of medical school. And I met people who were people like Ron McCoy, who's a Malaysian obstetrician, who delivered thousands of babies, but felt terrible about bringing them into a world that was full of nukes, and thought, what care am I providing for these babies that I've brought safely into the world, which is so full of peril and danger? And so I was inspired by these people, and I found myself basically, sitting with them, brainstorming, what do we do next? while I was in medical school, we had the frustrating experience of witnessing the total inaction of the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in 2005. And out of that frustration with the established kind of stasis of the discussions about what should be getting rid of nuclear weapons, was born this new idea, this campaign, this international campaign that might bring together all of these different folks that have been working on nukes for so long in one big umbrella to counter the nuclear umbrella that we're up against. And so I was so fortunate to be part of that first committee of ICAN as it emerged out of the infrastructure of MAPW. I was there when we picked the name, when we wanted something positive, and I want to acknowledge that at the moment we all need something positive. We're tired. I think our hearts are really heavy. We wake up every morning to bad news, more bad news, destruction, death, more poor policy decisions, more threats of war on top of the existing war, more dispossession, less human rights. And we can see so much darkness and doom when we look around us. And we, at the time when we were thinking about what do we do to reinvigorate the anti-nuclear movement, we wanted something positive. And so the idea of ICAN really resonated with us. So that led to what I have to say is one of the most extraordinary things I've ever been witness to, which is not only getting together a whole bunch of people who probably loosely knew of each other and had similar goals, but really didn't ever have the same single focus. People from over 500 partner organizations in over 100 countries, pulling in the same direction, and bringing along with them decision makers from governments. And what that has led to is something which addresses a huge legal gap that has existed for a long time. So for a very long time, in international law, as awful, as immoral, as destructive as nuclear weapons have been, they have not been illegal. And so the work of of ICAN has been to be the main civil society partner, bringing the will of the people, the will of you and me, of everyday human beings, to the halls of power, and garnering support from like-minded and sympathetic governments to get a treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons through the UN. And that was achieved in 2017. And that, of course, is the answer to the question, well, how did you guys get the Nobel Peace Prize? And that is the reason, because as the main civil society partners, that was recognized and acknowledged. Now, in this 80th year, it's important to acknowledge how long it's been since those bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and also since the first nuclear test. And last month, we commemorated the 80th anniversary of the Trinity nuclear test in New Mexico. And, when that was done, there was this there was so much hubris, but one of the layers of that hubris was this idea that we're just going to do this out here because there's no one here. But everywhere they've been used, nuclear weapons have disrupted human life, the environment, and even with that first nuclear test, we see that interference with the lives, the livelihoods, and the traditional ways of being and knowing of indigenous folks. And that was part of the New Mexico situation as well. And so as we look to the future, we have to think with reverence and respect of the past, of the hibakusha from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but of the survivors and victims from everywhere that nuclear weapons have been used. And we think about the downwinders in New Mexico. We think about all of the people, in the South Australian desert. We think about the people from Kazakhstan, the people throughout the Pacific who have been on the receiving ends of these awful, indiscriminate, filthy, disgusting weapons. And I always come back to the words of Setsuko Thurlow, and she said a great many things in her speech, which she was able to deliver on our collective behalf in Oslo in 2017 when we were awarded that Nobel Peace Prize. And her words remind me that the real prize isn't the Nobel, it'll be a world free of nuclear weapons. That's what we must keep our eyes focused on and keep our gaze fixed on. And she said, at the time it had been 7 decades since that awful time as a child when she had to reach towards the light in her school that had been destroyed, the only person from her class to make it out as a young child in Hiroshima. And she said, I have been waiting for this moment for 7 decades, and now it has finally arrived. This is the beginning of the end of nuclear weapons. And there are a great many other things that she said that stay with me. She said, each person who died had a name. Each person was loved by someone. Elsewhere, she's spoken about being able, at the time when the treaty came into force, when enough countries had signed and ratified it, to go back, and she had this image of this cloud of witnesses, of herself proclaiming to the dead, to those who had already passed, what was happening here on Earth amongst the living. And that gives me chills, because it makes me remember that what we do together to advance peace and justice matters on a cosmic level. It matters on a spiritual level. It matters to the ancestors. It matters to the survivors and those who perished. And in this 80th year, I'm very fortunate that I'm going to be able to go to Nagasaki for our Congress of the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, where we'll be meeting and listening to the hibakusha. But 80 years from that awful day, there are less and less first-generation hibakusha still alive. And one thing that impressed me when I first met the medical students from Japan 21 years ago in Beijing was how seriously they took the holding of those stories of the hibakusha, and they understood that receiving the stories and retelling them and amplifying their words and their voices was really such an important calling that they had as a continuation of this work to end nuclear weapons. And so as we honor them, we have to think about what they've asked us to do. And very blessedly in the year of 2024, so just last year, the Nobel Committee saw fit to award the Nobel Peace Prize to Nihon Hadankyo, which is the biggest organization of survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's the peak organization of the hibakusha. And so when we listen to them and what is it that they want us to do, they're very clear that what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki must never happen again. And in practical terms, that means we have to get rid of nuclear weapons, because either we get rid of them or they're going to get rid of us. And so when I think of us working together, I think about the wonderful thing we've already managed to achieve in having a campaign like ICANN, having a treaty like the TPNW. There's so much work still to be done. There's a lot of countries that need to join on to that. And there's a lot of work we all need to do to figure out how can we best leverage this wonderful treaty. And one way is that now we have international law that tells us that the use or even threat of use of nuclear weapons is illegal. You can check with your pension fund, with your super, with your bank to find out if they're invested in nuclear weapons. And through the program called Quit Nukes, both MAPW and ICANN Australia have tried to create some resources for you. So if you just Google Quit Nukes, you should get some information which will help you to do something practical to make sure that you're directing your funds away from this work and towards life-giving things. Little things like that, they all add up. We all have a role to play. So on one hand, when we all come together, we can work to make a treaty that prohibits nuclear weapons, wins a Nobel Peace Prize, and shifts the dial towards justice. And then in contrast, you see other international collaborations that Australia has seen fit to participate in. And I'm sure Vince will touch on this in more detail, but I can't help but think of those awful F-35 bombers that we've been hearing so much about and so many lies about. And there's collaboration, and then there's collaboration. I'd like to work with each of you, as many of us have already been working, for a world without arms, without war, without nukes, without destruction. A world where children get to grow up and have normal problems. And in contrast, we live in a world where increased militarization, accompanied with nuclearization, is gaining pace and gaining momentum. And every day we wake up with new terrible news for not only Gaza, but the West Bank, from Yemen, from Sudan, from, so many parts of the world that are hurting. And the only people that benefit from that are the people selling weapons. And so when you hear the acting Prime Minister of Australia say that we don't have any part in sending weapons to Israel, but then you find out that no, we actually make essential parts for these bombers that it don't work without the Australian bits. You lose faith and lose trust in anything that's being said. So I'd like us to take the instructions from our dear Hibaksha, our dear witnesses, from what it is to experience nuclear weapons, from our own Indigenous people in this country who've suffered the nuclear tests here and their descendants, to take their instructions and to work towards the kind of collaboration which gets rid of nuclear weapons, not the kind of collaboration which gets bombers into the air over the people of Gaza. I thank you all for being here. It's really an honor, and I know that there's a lot of other things going on. I assume you've all run the city to surf this morning already, so I thank you for your fortitude in being here. It doesn't go unnoticed. We must remember what Setsuko said. We're bearing witness to not only each other, but to the ancestors. Thank you.
Wasn't that just fantastic, everyone? You can't come to a peace movement thing without knowing, without being part of a raffle or buying a badge. So if you there's the Sydney badge if you haven't already got one. Peter, have you got them? But anyway, they're over here if you want one. And if you want to get a bulk order, we won't stop you. Okay, and so they're a solidarity price for $5, but if you haven't got that, $2 will help us break even. Okay, so now I was checking with Vince, and we first met Vince in 2011, and he was at the anti-basis campaign, and he wrote a small booklet for us about the pivot to Asia that was the brainchild of Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State in the Obama administration. So that's how long we've known Vince, and it's with great pleasure that I introduce Vince. Please welcome him to the microphone.
Okay, thank you very much, Dennis, for the introduction. Thank you to the Hiroshima Day Committee and the Muslim Collective for organising today and for inviting me to Faraz. And thank you, Ruth, for that wonderful, wonderful speech, a very personal, moving and very uplifting talk about what can be achieved as individuals, but also as a collective when we come together. I think in hindsight, we probably should have reversed the order of the presentations, because I've got, after that very uplifting speech, I'm going to be deflating everyone by talking about the ways in which Australia has increasingly become integrated into nuclear war and nuclear war planning. So we might have to get Ruth up again after me to lift everyone's spirits again, talk about all the positive things that we can do and that ICANN has done in this space. So yes, the title of my talk is Australia's Nuclear Posture, Old and New. So nuclear posture is just a fancy way of saying the ways in which Australia's defence policy factor in nuclear weapons. And I'm going to be talking about an old story. Australia's been involved in indirect ways in nuclear war planning for decades, but there's a very new story as well, a very a concerning story about the way that Australia is integrated into nuclear war and nuclear war planning with the United States in particular. So I'm going to focus on these two dimensions. And there's three kind of key ways. I'm going to talk about the way in which Australia is integrated in nuclear weapons and nuclear war. So the first two, as I mentioned, are old, decades old in fact, and the third is more new or recent. The first one is extended nuclear deterrence. So the United States has this policy of extended nuclear deterrence, otherwise known as a nuclear umbrella, where it provides protection from its by its nuclear weapons should one of its allies become a threat to or face a nuclear attack. And Australia accepts and supports this policy. And I'll talk a little bit more about the details of that in a moment. Then we've got the what are called the Joint Defence Facilities. Really, they're American bases, but they're called Joint Defence Facilities. The US has access to probably over 50 Australian bases and facilities in Australia, but the two most important ones with respect to nuclear weapons are Pine Gap and Northwest Cape. And they're involved in indirect ways in nuclear war planning through intelligence, communications, support. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then the last one is the new way. And so this is over the last, since the pivot to Asia, actually, which is where all this started, but it's accelerated, in fact, over the last, say, 5 years with the US Force Posture Initiatives. We now host to US nuclear-capable forces, so strategic aircraft in particular, but potentially, possibly also nuclear-armed submarines in the future. And so these, both the old and new ways, and in particular, points 2 and 3 there, make Australia not only complicit in defensive and offensive US nuclear operations, but they also make Australia a nuclear target in very profound ways. Okay, so US extended nuclear deterrence. So this is essentially a threat that Australia and the United States pursued to or threatened to kill thousands or even millions of an adversary that would otherwise, that had or threatens to attack Australia with a nuclear weapon. So the idea is that, yes, Australia doesn't have nuclear weapons itself, but because we come under the nuclear umbrella of the United States, if another state were to threaten or to actually use nuclear weapons on Australia, the United States would respond with a nuclear strike on that country. And of course, nuclear weapons are indiscriminate weapons. They're not discriminate weapons. They're not precision weapons. So that would result in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and if it was a large nuclear strike, potentially millions of innocent civilians would perish. Now, I think that's morally repugnant to have that kind of policy, to even threaten the destruction of so many people. But it's part of our official defence policy. I think it's highly morally objectionable. And so that's one very on its own. That's one reason to object to the policy. But also, it's implausible practically. So there's no actual commitment from the United States. There's nothing in the ANZUS Treaty that says that they would, in fact, defend Australia from a nuclear or respond to a nuclear strike on Australia. There's been no official declaration, public, and no document from the United States that says that that's the case. It's an assumption on the part of Australian officials based on, we don't know, maybe private discussions. It's never been clarified. And so you often hear this, in response to this idea of US extended nuclear deterrence, you hear this kind of phrase, would the US sacrifice, Seattle for Sydney? In other words, if a adversary was to launch a nuclear strike on Australia and the US were to respond in kind, the US would then become a target from that country, and would they really risk sacrificing one of their cities in order to come to the defence of Australia? I think highly unlikely, even more unlikely given the Trump administration is now in power, but I think it's always been very unlikely. And so US extended nuclear deterrence is practically implausible and morally objectionable. So on both those two grounds, I think it's problematic. The other part of the old story about Australia's involvement in US nuclear warfighting is the Naval Communication Station Harold E. Holt, after the Australian Prime Minister, from which it was named, otherwise referred to as Northwest Cape. It's located in Western Australia, about 15 kilometres north of Exmouth. And as you can see in the images there, it's essentially these 12 very large towers, more than 300 metres high, and they support a network of antennas for the transmission of very low frequency signals to submerge US nuclear armed submarines right in the Indian Ocean. So if the US were to launch a nuclear strike from the submarines, the communications could very well come through Australia, through Northwest Cape, to those submarines. There was a famous case in 1973. This was during the, I guess it was the fourth Arab-Israeli War, the Yom Kippur War, where the Soviet Union and the United States came into a potential open conflict. The nuclear readiness scale, DEFCON, 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest, kind of escalated, and the United States had put its nuclear forces on level DEFCON 3, nuclear readiness, and Northwest Cape was part of that order. And at the time, it was done without the prior knowledge of Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, right? And he was not too happy about that and made a big fuss about it afterwards. But the point is that, you know, Australia, that possibility still exists to the present day. Probably the most famous of the joint facilities, of course, is Pine Gap. So this was established in 1970s in the Northern Territory, just outside of Alice Springs. And it primarily has been the way that Australia has been integrated into US nuclear planning and fighting, both in defensive and offensive roles, in numerous ways. I've got 5 up there on the slide. So there's nuclear attack planning and support. So if you think about, this is a framework that that Professor Richard Tanter uses, probably Australia's foremost expert on Pine Gap, talks about big ears and big eyes of Pine Gap. So the big eyes are the satellites that Pine Gap controls in space that are sucking up intelligence, military intelligence and communications and so on, of foreign adversaries and allies alike of the United States. And then satellite ground stations that are also sucking up information from foreign countries' satellites and sucking up that information as well. So they exist in those radome, golf ball-looking radomes there in Pine Gap. They're there to protect the satellites and also probably to protect, you know, make it difficult to know where they're pointing at any particular time. So information from those big ears is, you know, information about enemy radars, air defences, being able to track mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles, missile submarines at sea, and so forth. And so that kind of information would be really important, of course, in a nuclear war to target that infrastructure. Then there's the big eyes. So these are the infrared satellites, geostationary orbit, that are able to detect missile launches. And so in the case that a country were to fire nuclear weapons at the United States, the Pine Gap would pick that up and give the United States maybe a few minutes of warning before they would rain destruction. Then there's nuclear second strike targeting. So the US will want to know when an ICBM is launched out of a silo, which ones are empty, so it doesn't have to target them in a second strike, right, in a response strike. So they would be used, the information from Pine Gap would be used in that way. Then we've got missile defense. So Pine Gap can detect through its infrared satellites in the first moments of an intercontinental ballistic missile launch to help determine, calculate the trajectory of that missile, and then pass that information on to US ballistic missile defense forces, say on a ship out in the Pacific Ocean, Indian Ocean, or wherever it is, and help cue that ship to intercept that missile. So it would be used in ballistic missile defense. And then the last way is through verification of arms control agreements. Of course, there's very precious little actual arms control agreements around anymore. What does exist is it's either dead or it's dying anyway. So that function is pretty much defunct, more or less. So these are all the ways that Pine Gap implicates Australia in nuclear war fighting, defensive and offensive operations, but it also, of course, makes it a high priority nuclear target. So during the Cold War, Pine Gap was, the Soviet Union definitely had a nuclear intercontinental ballistic missile pointed at Pine Gap, and probably today Russia still does, and probably even China as well. Pine Gap and the other intelligence facilities are implicated in Australia in nuclear war, but they're also, and that's kind of the focus of the presentation today, but I just want to point out they're also implicated in Australian and American conventional wars and the wars that the United States supports. So we can't say for sure what intelligence Pine Gap is sharing with the United States and then the United States is sharing with Israel, but it's highly likely that the intelligence that comes from Pine Gap is in fact being passed on from the United States and then on to Israel to assist in its genocide in Gaza. That's the signals intelligence type of intelligence that I spoke to you about before. It was also probably implicated in the 12-day war with Iran, the Israel-Iran war as well. Would have been relaying signals intelligence to assist the United States when it attacked, but particularly also Israel. Of course, Israel and the US have other forms of intelligence gathering that they would have been using, but Pine Gap likely would have been a part of that operation as well. Certainly, when the United States had its ballistic missile defense ships parked in the Mediterranean off Israel, intercepting missiles that Iran was retaliating against Israel during that war, information from Pine Gap very likely would have been sent to those ballistic missile ships to help intercept those missiles and so on. But also in locating Iranian mobile launchers, picking up, the Iranian military communications, all forms of kind of targeting and interception. It's quite likely that Pine Gap would have been involved. Although we can't say for sure, because when questions are asked of the government about this, the response, as journalists have asked very directly, Albanese and Wong and Miles, is Pine Gap involved in either Gaza or in the war in Iran or Lebanon or anywhere else? The answer is we don't comment on intelligence operations, intelligence facilities. So, so then we've got AUKUS. So this is part of the new story. So Pine Gap, Northwest Cape, US extended nuclear deterrence. That's the old story. The new story, a lot of the focus has been on AUKUS, and I can understand why. It's $365 billion being spent on submarines that we probably won't ever actually get. If we do get them, there are several ways in which they implicate us in nuclear warfighting. So the submarines themselves won't be nuclear armed; they're nuclear powered, but that doesn't mean they don't have a nuclear role. Nuclear powered submarines are important because they're powered by nuclear power. They have almost unlimited endurance. So if you want to use them, in faraway operations in faraway theatres. One of the most common ways that nuclear attack submarines are used by foreign nuclear powers is to hunt down the nuclear-armed submarines of adversaries. So it's plausible that Australian submarines could be used in that way in a potential conflict with China, hunting Chinese SSBNs. Which China would consider to be an existential threat, because that would be their second strike deterrent. They could be deployed in a less direct way, probably more likely to maintain control over critical maritime choke points in Southeast Asia, and that would then help free the United States submarines to target China's nuclear submarines. So kind of a divide and conquer kind of role between Australia and the United States submarines. And then we have as part of the AUKUS deal, there's a new submarine base that's being upgraded at HMAS Sterling to support and maintain US Virginia-class attack submarines, so that they can be maintained there, repaired in dry dock and so on. All US nuclear attack submarines don't have nuclear weapons on them at the moment. They were removed in 1991, the end of the Cold War. But Congress has authorized for the development of a new nuclear cruise missile that could be put on the attack submarines that will be rotating through HMAS Sterling. And it only takes a presidential directive to reverse the decision that was made at the first Bush administration, I believe, Matt, that presidential directive to remove the nuclear cruise missiles from Virginia-class attack submarines. So it only takes a presidential directive to do that. And as I mentioned, funding, I think in the first Trump administration, was authorized to develop a new nuclear missile that could be put on those submarines. So we could in the future have American nuclear-armed submarines, not nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed submarines, forward-based at HMAS Sterling. And so AUKUS has got most of the focus, and like I said, I think rightly so, but AUKUS is very far off if we even get these submarines, right? But what's happening right now is that we have, as a result of the US force posture initiatives, we have nuclear-capable US strategic bombers, B-2s, B-52s, B-1s. B-1s aren't nuclear-capable, but they're strategic bombers. But certainly the B-2s and the B-52s are now rotating regularly through Australian bases. That's been happening for quite a long time. We've had B-52s from the 1980s, in fact, under different circumstances in the 80s. But what's different now is that a few years ago, it was not announced, because the government doesn't announce these things, it was revealed by Four Corners documentary, that we would be at the Tyndall Air Force Base in the Northern Territory would be host to the forward deployment of up to 6 B-52s. So these bombers would be coming in on a rotational basis, but the infrastructure that's being set up, a squadron's operation facility for intelligence gathering, for crew briefings, for missions, for strategic planning and so on, big fuel farms, maintenance facilities, weapons depots and so on. This is permanent infrastructure that's going to be for use by the United States in order to conduct strategic operations from Australian soil. This would be the first time in Australian history that Australia, or since World War II, I should say, where we have Australian bases being used as a base of operations for potential strategic operations by American aircraft. So this is very new, and it's happening now. It's not far off in the future. These bombers are rotating through now, and the upgrades for Tyndall will be completed by next year. 2 minutes? Okay, yeah. So we had a kind of a vision of what this might look like just last year. So this didn't get much media attention, but as part of the Biden administration's war against Yemen, we had 2 American B-2 strategic bombers that were flown out of the United States. They went on a non-stop mission, being refueled by aerial tankers all along the way, and they crossed Australian airspace. And we had, there's a picture there of 4 American KC-135 aerial refuelers that were parked on the ground in Cairns. And they took off as the B-2 bombers flew over Australia. They refueled the American B-2 bombers, and those B-2 bombers went off, continued on en route to Yemen to bomb a couple of cities in Yemen. And then they were refueled again on the way back. This is kind of a taste of the kind of operations that I think the US is building up Australia to be engaged with. So this is, American refuelers, but we have exercises we do with the United States where we have RAAF refueling American B-52 and B-2 bombers, Australian F-35s, providing air protection, and other support roles for nuclear-capable strategic aircraft. Now, in this case, of course, it was a conventional bombing, but those B-2 bombers can carry nuclear weapons as well. And so it was kind of, what that operation showed was that, this is what the US is kind of building up our Australian bases to be able to carry out these types of operations, not just in the Middle East, but I think more prominently, in East Asia and the Pacific in the case of a war with China. Okay, I'm just going to end on this one because I'm running out of time. So I'll finish on this slide. It's really important to understand that there are no policy or legal impediments in Australia to the United States launching nuclear operations from Australia. So Australia is a party to the Rarotonga Treaty in 1986, which established the Southwest Pacific Nuclear Free Zone. That means that nuclear weapons cannot be stationed in Australia. Right? So it's illegal for under that treaty for nuclear weapons to be stationed on Australia. It does not prevent a foreign power like the United States from bringing nuclear weapons on aircraft, or visiting on ships. And because the United States has a worldwide policy of neither confirming nor denying whether its airplanes or ships have nuclear weapons on them, and our government apparently doesn't ask, we have a don't ask, don't tell policy, then we don't know. And we won't know if the US, as it's rotating its strategic bombers through, has nuclear weapons on board. And there is no, as I mentioned, political, but there's no policy to prevent that from happening, and there's no legal impediment until and when we sign on to the Nuclear Ban Treaty, right? Which then, of course, it would be illegal. Okay, so I was going to talk about the 1980s a little bit, but I'll end there because we won't get a chance. I'll just say very quickly, maybe we can bring it up in the Q&A, but during the 1980s, we did have B-52s operating, but Malcolm Fraser at the time explicitly declared that those B-52s would not be allowed to carry nuclear weapons over Australia. That contrasts very much with the situation today. But it points out that when you do have a leader that can stand up to the United States, and Malcolm Fraser was no dove, but when he stood up for Australian sovereignty, national independence, he got an exception to the US worldwide policy of neither confirm nor deny, and forced the United States to declare that it did not have nuclear weapons on its planes. So, you know, if Fraser could do it in the height of the Cold War in the 1980s, why couldn't we at least do that today? Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Vince. That was very frightening, as he promised, and it gives one a cause for reflection that we have such a long way to go, as Ruth said earlier. Look, I've called this next section an interlude because I promised that I would only speak for 5 minutes. So I've got my alarm on. So the minute it goes 5, I'll shut up. I'll try and get in before 5 minutes. When we're faced with a problem this huge, the idea is that we grab the near edge of it, and in various ways we try and find where that near edge is. And for example, when we were doing AUKUS, well, obviously. HMAS Cuttable, used to be called Garden Island, is handy. Or we could go to the town hall, or we go to the Defence Department. I came across this poem written by a Palestinian, and she said, "Wherever you are, whatever sand you can throw in the gears of genocide, do it now. If it's a handful, throw it. If it's a fingernail full, scrape it out and throw. Get in the way in whatever way you can. Get in the way of genocide in whatever way you can." This is a variation on the quote about, if you think you're too small, try spending a night in a room with a mosquito. And so we've been to events like this, and we go away feeling quite relaxed and that we've done something good. And then after a while, we think, well, we've got to keep it going. I went to a very important seminar. And there were fantastic speeches. And then at the end of it, people said, yes, but what do we do? What do we do? And so this is an attempt to do that, to answer that. The first thing sounds pretty ordinary. On the 15th of the month, the 15th of September, a couple of years ago, your former beloved Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, signed the AUKUS agreement. So on the 15th of the month, we send a message to we try and get as many people to send a message to the Prime Minister saying it's stupid, silly, it's over, it's too expensive, etc. on the 15th of every month. So if you want to be in the 15th of the month club, sorry, Vince, would you pass that, one of those ones that have 15 on it? Yep. So Vince is handing around 15th of the month club. So just if it comes to you, just hand it on. If you want to do it, put your email on there, and we'll send you a message around about the 12th of the month. I'm doing most of it, so if I forget and you get on the 16th, don't worry, a day or two either way, it doesn't matter. Okay, and then we talk about joining other people, like-minded people. Now, of course, we want the Hiroshima Day Committee, and the Hiroshima Day Committee goes from May till August every year. And I don't want to make a point of it, and I'm not trying to get a birthday present, but in a few days' time, it'll be the 15th of August, which was the end of World War II. 2 days after that, in 1945, I was born. So you can work out how old I am. So, but there are more permanent groups. ICANN has a permanent petition for the Australian government to sign the agreements, sign the Prohibition Treaty. There's P&D, there's anti-bases, there's the AUKUS group called SAC. There's religious-based groups, and we'll get to the Muslim collective later. But we're asking people to consider joining one of those sort of groups. And when it comes to activism, the ball at the bottom is writing letters and so on, and the ball at the top is taking over Parliament. So there are a lot of steps in between. So it doesn't matter which ball you're on. But, that's my what's the name? To stop. So it doesn't matter which ball you're on. You're doing something. So don't be shy. Okay. Now, this is where the technology comes in. Are we right for Tom? Sorry. For Tom. Tom Antarania is chair of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in the United Kingdom. Tom works for the Bertrand Russell Peace Foundation, where he co-edits the Spokesman Journal and edits the European Nuclear Disarmament Info newsletter. So, would you please welcome Tom?
And to the Muslim Collective for organising today's events. I'm assuming you can all see me on the screen, and those online can see my face.
Yes, we can
also,
see.
Massive thanks to Ruth and to Vince for their really important contributions. Look, we all know why we're here. It's the 80th anniversary of the US bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and everything that means. It's the anniversary of the opening of the atomic age. This week is the anniversary of a new year zero, a phase in human history where humans demonstrated that they'd reached the point, progressed, some might even say, to the point where we've developed technologies that could result in the extermination of all life on this planet. That's what we're commemorating this week. And it's 80 years on. It's also 89 seconds to midnight, that point where all of human life risks extinction across the planet. And not just human life, the whole biodiversity, animal life, and everything that goes with it. But for all too many people, and I'm thinking in particular of those in Gaza today, midnight has already arrived. And just as our rulers, just as our leaders, so-called, those with power, have not taken responsibility for the events at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, have seemed, in the opposite direction, to have done everything they can to accelerate and to accentuate the dangers posed by nuclear weapons and nuclear capabilities. They have failed to intervene. They have failed to stop the reality of midnight being unleashed on the people of Gaza. And so, from top to bottom, from 80 years ago to 89 seconds to midnight, to the situation we have in Gaza right now, and the risks posed by further nuclear proliferation and instability mean that our work and everything that we do on an international scale is of vital importance. So spreading nuclear technology is at the heart of this AUKUS deal that we've already heard about today. And as you know, the US and UK are collaborating with Australia to provide nuclear-powered submarines. Currently, only 6 countries, all nuclear weapon states, have nuclear-powered subs. Australia will become the 7th and the first non-nuclear weapon state to acquire nuclear reactors to power submarines. This is nuclear proliferation, even if it will take some time, as Vince pointed out, if it ever happens, for the AUKUS plan to come to fruition. It is proliferation, and clearly it constitutes a breach of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, even if the issue has never been fully scrutinised at NPT meetings, and even if no state party to the treaty, and that's most of the states in the world, has seriously interrogated this development. Now, all 9 known nuclear-armed states, including Israel, are actively involved in developing new nuclear capabilities, either by technological development or, as with the current case of the UK government, increasing nuclear warhead stockpiles, buying nuclear-capable F-35A jets, and then with a plan to participate in NATO's, the Nuclear Armed Alliance's, nuclear sharing agreement across Europe, and participation in schemes like AUKUS. Actual nuclear proliferation within existing nuclear armed states is a significant factor in international instability, acting alongside the potentially destabilising prospect of new nuclear armed states. In fact, the contradiction at the heart of the NPT, official recognition of and legitimacy for nuclear armed states, in itself drives proliferation within these states and stretches non-proliferation frameworks to the point of ineffectiveness. The recent decade has not been an auspicious one for non-proliferation arms control and disarmament treaties, notwithstanding the full frontal rejection of nuclearism embodied in the TPNW, which we've already heard about this evening. It's evident that the US in particular and her NATO allies seem determined to upend the nuclear order, this thing that was painstakingly established over decades, and they want to upend this order to their own advantage. How else to reconcile the destruction of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the JCPOA or the Iran deal? How else to explain the fate of open skies and the likely end of New START? There has been a bonfire of these treaties and these arrangements, and the result has been a nuclear tinderbox. This process has intensified as the US has held firm to an America First international doctrine as the basis for US global dominance, was drastically undermined by the rise of alternative centres of power, which hold very different points of view. As NATO expanded and increasingly adopted global intentions, treaty after treaty and agreement after agreement was shattered. The British government argues that AUKUS, the AUKUS agreement, does not contravene the NPT because the shared technology is for nuclear power, not nuclear weapons. The NPT does not stop the exchange of civil nuclear technology, but it stipulates it must be for peaceful purposes only. But this exchange, this proposed exchange, is not peaceful. The pact enables the transference of weapons-grade enriched uranium to power war-fighting submarines undertaking provocative actions in potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific region. The AUKUS announcement was the second time in 2021, when it was first announced, that the British government appeared to breach its alleged NPT commitments. In March of that year, the Integrated Review, which is a government document around defence and security, or what they call defence and security, included a clause to increase by 40% the total number of nuclear warheads stored in this country, reversing a previous trend and contravening its obligations to take steps to disarm. The AUKUS Pact is a dangerous escalation in the West's ongoing confrontation with China. More than a decade ago, the US announced its Asian pivot, refocusing US military, strategic, and naval resources towards the Asia Pacific. Around 100,000 US troops are based across Japan, Australia, South Korea, Guam, and Hawaii, and over 400 US bases encircle China. The dynamics surrounding this pivot intensified under the first Trump administration and under the Biden administration, and the dynamics have continued to evolve under the most recent Trump administration, and in particular with reference to European remilitarization. And it's been clear for some time, even before Trump's election, that European states and their NATO allies were engaged in a careful, well-crafted and strategic shift to what might be called a war footing. The reasons for this shift are manifold, but the most significant thing to keep in mind, as demonstrated by what we know about AUKUS, is that we are not talking about a very recent development. Recent events have simply accelerated matters. What we're witnessing is a coordinated effort to prop up and facilitate US power, economic, political, and military, in the face of global tectonic shifts. These shifts are creating a situation where global power is no longer concentrated in the hands of one state alone. The move from a unipolar to a multipolar world order is well underway. But it seems clear that whatever view you take of the other states rising in prominence, this process is basically unstoppable. Yet in the face of challenges to US dominance, the US itself and its allies, the NATO member states first and foremost, are engaged in desperate, reckless, and potentially deadly measures in an attempt to halt these shifts. To summarize, as we know, the situation is very dangerous indeed. And AUKUS is part and parcel of this process. Just as with the recent US Strategic Defence Review, UK Strategic Defence Review, we are supposed to believe that this ramped up militarism will result in some sort of public good. For instance, with reference to the proposed increase in British military spending, the British Prime Minister conjured the idea of a defence dividend. A defence dividend. He claimed that his plan for remilitarisation will, quote, drive jobs and investment throughout the country, providing local opportunities, skilled work, community pride. And this is particularly relevant for plans like AUKUS, which will be large parts of the nuclear equipment will be manufactured in a industrial town in the middle of England, Derby, at the Rolls-Royce factory, where there is a sense of real identity in the workforce and commitment to it. So he knows who he's playing to. Prime Minister Starmer announced 6 new munitions factories and promised that these will create over 1,000 jobs. Further, he announced that the UK will build thousands of new long-range weapons that will support around 800 more jobs. According to Starmer, Britain will deliver up to 12 attack submarines to be sold to Australia. And you don't need to be a military genius to work out what or who these attack submarines are supposed to attack in that region of the world. And the world will have taken note of what he said. Britain will, to quote him again, deliver a new submarine every 18 months, creating thousands of jobs. Promises, promises, promises. Is it 2,000 jobs? 4,000? 100,000 jobs? He doesn't say. But 12 subs times 1.5 years is 18 years. What happens to these hundreds of jobs, these thousands of jobs after 18 years? So here's the rub. The so-called defence dividend, a cynical flipping of the hoped-for but never delivered peace dividend after the end of the Cold War, is a myth. Worse, it's a lie, and a deliberate one. For example, the new military Keynesians want us to believe that increased military spending will boost the overall economy and society as a whole. Yet the British Chancellor of the Exchequer demonstrated in recent statements and decisions that this is a lie. It is a deliberate lie. Her recent statement was clear that a marginal increase in defence spending required the almost complete slashing of the overseas aid budget. We're supposed to believe that state spending on missiles, tanks, aircraft, ships and submarines has a beneficial impact on the economy as a whole. But building these things simply does not and cannot make a significant beneficial impact on society. A tank does not make the trains run on time or decrease journey times. A missile does not increase the efficiency of public infrastructure. There's no socially useful purpose for a nuclear-powered nuclear-armed submarine. These devices, if they ever work in any sense, are designed and manufactured to destroy, disrupt, and to kill. They are not socially beneficial. Compare the relative social impacts of a tank factory and a new rail line. Which one has the biggest overall, long-standing, and enduring beneficial impact on society? Which one will still be there in 10, 20, 50, 100 years? Analysis for the Scottish government puts a big question mark over claims around military spending and jobs. For example, we're told that military spending is supposed to be jobs rich. This, despite the fact that military spending has only marginal economic benefits for society as a whole. Military spending has one of the lowest employment multipliers, ranking 70 out of 100. Employment multipliers measure how changes of employment in one sector of the economy ripple out to other sections of the economy. Health is ranked first. According to data in the Alternative Defence Review, which CND was part of publishing in response to the government's plans, agriculture, energy, food, manufacturing, chemicals, iron, steel, transport, computers and construction all have greater employment multipliers than military spending. The Alternative Review also points out that investing in health is 2.5 times more job rich than military spending. We're being sold a lie, and the lie is dangerous, not only because of the domestic impact it has on society and the economy as a whole, but it's driving the nuclear tensions globally. It's driving the risks, it's driving the threats. And as Seymour Melman pointed out repeatedly in his pioneering studies of militarized and demilitarized societies in the 70s and 80s, military spending in highly militarized societies simply skews and distorts economies as a whole, making them less efficient and less responsive to pressing social need. And so, there is a distinct and terrible link between the developing AUKUS relationship, European rearmament, global tectonic shifts, and the tilt to the Asia-Pacific region. Australia, or the Australian government more precisely, seems to be willing to play its part in attempting to prop up US global dominance and driving ever-increasing global risks. We're at 89 seconds to midnight. The situation is dangerous. Our tasks are urgent. So further discussion, further planning, and further collaboration on an international scale to confront and turn back all of these things, to resist the global war drive, which I believe we're in, are absolutely essential. Thank you.
Tom, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. Would you mind staying there? And would the two other panelists come out here? What I want the audience to do is to think whether you want to make a comment or whether you want to ask a question. Now, I didn't mention that Tom would have got up fairly early on a Sunday morning. So thank you very much for that. Has anyone got a question for Tom? Natasha? Can you hear okay, Tom?
Hello. Hi, Tom. Hi, I'm a teacher and I work for the New South Wales Teachers Federation. And I have a question around the very thing you're talking about. Getting other unions to work collectively in this space often is blocked by the difficulty that other industries have in turning away work to make products that contribute to war. And some unions find it hard to work in that space because jobs for workers matters. but the work itself is potentially contributing to F-35 bombs, etc., planes, beg your pardon, or some other part of the machinery. So what you're talking about around the benefits of other types of work and jobs versus the very point you're just making, what can I read that actually makes a clear case for the difference? And also the other question I was going to ask is about nationalised industries and how much obviously private companies as opposed to government-run industries influence the ability to control what is produced in a country democratically through the electorate. I don't know if that made sense.
Tom, over to you.
It's an incredibly difficult issue to tackle, and we have incredible difficulties here. So the largest single trade union in the United Kingdom is a general trade union, which represents people in the public sector, the private sector, from healthcare workers to those who work in weapons manufacturing industries. And the situation in the UK is not great in terms of union participation and union recognition that alternatives are there and alternatives are available. Where we do see positive signs are generally in those unions which are not directly involved in representing arms manufacturing workers, for instance. So, for instance, the National Education Union, the Civil Service Union, the Railway Workers Union in the UK are all positively engaged in thinking through and analysing alternatives. But there is, in the UK in particular, I can think of, there are examples of where groups of workers, including in the arms industry, have taken a different course. And some of you may have heard about the Lucas Alternative Plan, which was designed by collectively, and which was an insurgent effort, ultimately failed, but it was an insurgent effort nonetheless, by groups of workers in the arms industry to move away from destructive manufacturing towards what they called socially useful production. And so I think if you consult various bookshops, you will be able to find some publications that I was actually involved in making available, including Hilary Wainwright's The Lucas Plan, but also the work of Mike Cooley, who was a central figure in all of this. In terms of wider pressing global analysis of kind of militarized societies, the go-to person, the first port of call is the work of Seymour Melman, and he has a number of books available, but there's also work produced by Gar Alperovitz in the United States and various others who look at economic structures in a slightly different way and aim their arguments towards the trade union movement and trade union activists more generally.
Thanks, Tom. Is that okay? Tom, Peter?
Thanks very much, Tom. My question relates to this recent treaty signed by Australia and the UK for a 49-year, I think, or 50-year agreement to support the submarines, the AUKUS submarines, and some other military cooperation. It seems a ridiculous idea from our end of the world, but what does it look like from your end? What does it look like in the UK, this treaty?
Well, apart from in the anti-war and the peace and anti-nuclear movements, it hasn't had a huge amount of attention, because what the British government is set on doing more generally is presenting itself as, a general picture of remilitarization of arms manufacturing, so on and so forth, and all of these alliances, are the basis for their idea for growth. But, we've already heard question marks from Vince around whether or not these nuclear submarines will ever actually be delivered, and there are questions around what's happening at Derby and their ability to, and the Rolls-Royce plant and their ability to manufacture these things. But there's a phase 2 of this 50-year agreement around the development of new technologies, technology transfer, nanotechnology, and the rest. I think is where the government will in the UK will focus its propaganda, if you like, and they will combine it with the more general fantasyland propaganda around the war footing that they're putting us on, the massive investment additional investment that they're making towards arms manufacturing, and the rest will somehow revolutionise the economy and society in the UK. And some people will buy it for a time, but there will come a point where nothing has been delivered, where nothing has been achieved, but where tens of billions of additional pounds have been invested in arms manufacturing and war preparation, to the detriment of other sections of society. And I think our headline task, is to do more of this discussion and to have an exchange of ideas. Because if there are materials and resources being used in Australia flagging up, what's behind this deal and criticisms of it, that's the sort of thing that we can usefully circulate and raise in the UK.
I think that's a very good idea, Tom. I think we should follow this up a bit more, that there should be some coordination between our two movements. There's a fairly strong anti-AUKUS group in just about every capital city. The one in Western Australia is very it's very strong as well. And there's a city just south of Sydney, Wollongong, where one of these bases is going to be set up, and we can already feel the sort of anger in Wollongong at the prospect of having a nuclear base in their city. So there is some movement and some strength to the anti-AUKUS feeling here, and we have been given the figure of $386 billion, and commentators are saying that's quite a small, that's quite a conservative figure. It could go up to 1,000 billion by the time there's anything in the water belonging to Australia. So it is quite a big issue. Do you mind if we might move on, if that's okay, to the other speakers? Do you mind staying on, Tom? You're not too tired?
I'm not too tired, but I do have to get my partner and son to the airport fairly shortly, so I wouldn't mind leaving.
All right. Okay. Well, how about? I think we could. How about a round of applause? Thank you very much, Tom. All right. Let's. This might be the start of something big, but at the meantime, you better pick up your son.
Yeah. Keep in touch. Okay. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.
Okay. Thanks. All right. Okay. Now. Sorry.
I wanted to pick up on something that was said just about AUKUS and collaboration. And I think that one of the, there's a lot of sort of technical information that we can share between ourselves and, activists and concerned citizens in the UK and in the United States as well. But some of the simpler things is to make sure we're sharing those talking points that we're using around things like AUKUS. And so certainly one of the things that we've been working on very hard is to emphasize the opportunity cost that AUKUS represents, and particularly framing it in the language of healthcare, not warfare. And so talking about how much benefit we could derive to our health system, for example, if even a tiny fraction of these terrible cost was invested into, primary care or tertiary care or any part of the health landscape. And so developing some of those talking points and some of those campaign kind of slogans is something that we can be sharing as well internationally to help focus people's minds on the things that really matter to them.
Okay. John, would you like a question or a comment?
It was a comment, personally, but hopefully there'll be
Just hold it a sec.
Well, initially directed towards Dr. Vince, but finally the rest of it to both of you. The highest DEFCON setting, paradoxically, is DEFCON 1, which is missiles incoming. The highest that the US has ever been is DEFCON 2. We're probably at DEFCON 3 now. And that sort of segues naturally into the rest of what I've got to say. We are actually at a point where the likelihood of nuclear war is as great or greater than it has ever been. Why isn't this room totally packed with deeply concerned people, and why aren't they queuing at the door to get in? And this is not only a problem that we face, it's a problem that the peace movement is facing right around the world.
Thanks. Vince?
You want me to answer that question? I thought
You
it
get
was a
all
comment.
these questions.
Yeah, sure. So on the question of, public awareness and support for anti-nuclear activities, I don't think it registers often a lot with ordinary Australians. Their concerns are far removed from these types of things. That's true of foreign policy and defence policy generally, often because the way that it's spoken about is spoken in very technical, complicated jargon. It's obviously, on the issue of nuclear weapons, I think the government does its best to not bring attention around this issue. There's been very few questions by journalists who often aren't very well informed around the B-52 issue, for example, the force posture initiatives, and Wong and Miles and Albanese very clever at deflecting those issues and questions by saying things like, "Oh, we're a member of the Rarotonga Treaty, so nuclear weapons can't be stationed here," and so on, and that really doesn't get to the heart of the issue that I was talking about, which is that there are no policy and legal impediments to nuclear weapons being launched from Australia, but they don't say that out loud. So there are obviously lots of things going on in the world at the moment, and people's commitments and time and energy is, divided and concentrated in other places, and that's very understandable, I think, at this time. So that's a kind of a more immediate kind of issue. But of course, all these things are connected in the way that we've been talking about. Why is it that Australia is taking this position to integrate itself further into US nuclear war planning? We've had Pine Gap and Northwest Cape and the other facilities for decades and US extended nuclear deterrence. Why over the last 5 years in particular, from the pivot, but really at the last 5 years, have we seen extraordinary numbers of US Air Force, Marines, Army, Navy rotating through Australia? Why are we building this permanent infrastructure? What is it that's driving that? It's China. Yeah, it's the great power competition between the United States and China, and Australia is picking a side. We're picking the United States. We're banking on the United States maintaining its position of dominance, military and economic. And that is, even though the forces, as I mentioned, funnily enough, have been used in Middle East conflict in Yemen, it's really the narrative that is justifying, the foundation that's justifying Australian further conventional and nuclear integration with the United States is China. And that's also driving increases in our defence spending. And all of the issues that we care about that are urgent, whether it's the climate crisis, whether it's inequality, whether it's the erosion of democracy, whether it's lack of funding or inadequate funding for health, for education, social issues, polarization. I mean, all these issues are all connected and are being exacerbated by the great power rivalry narrative that's being set up. And so whatever area that we're working in, I think connecting the nuclear issue, the defense issue, to the climate issue, to the environmental issue, to the domestic public education issue or health issue or whatever it may be, is the way to fill rooms like this.
I completely agree, Vince, with your analysis. I think we have a season where people are especially fatigued, especially the good folks of the world who care about the planet and the people in it, who care about justice and human rights. And so there's a very significant sense of fatigue and heaviness that we sit with, and we have to acknowledge that. And at the same time, be creative and thoughtful about how to do messaging in new ways, which allows people to engage with things where they're at. So there's there's a new resource that you might not be aware of, which is quite a thoughtful memorial that ICANN have put together. There's a children's memorial, so a tribute to the children who lost their lives in Hiroshima and Nagasaki years ago and in the years that followed. And that's available online, so it's a digital memorial where you can actually scroll through and get to know the individuals and the stories, all these children who had lives out in front of them, whose lives were lost. And I think that spending a bit of time in that archive has real meaning and purpose, because it allows us to acknowledge what Setsuko said, which is that, you know, every person that died had a name. Everyone was loved by someone. And one of the challenges with the nuclear weapons issue is that it doesn't feel super immediate. It doesn't feel tangible, personal. It doesn't feel upfront unless you know someone personally who's been a survivor of nuclear testing or nuclear weapons use. You know, unless you've sat there with that first-person narrative and looked at their body and seen the scars or the wounds inflicted, if you've seen the burns on the bodies, it feels a little bit more real. But otherwise, it's kind of, it does still feel a bit kind of abstract and theoretical. So I hope that archive is a resource that helps us to feel things more tangibly. And it's also something we can offer to people who maybe want to learn something more or commemorate this particular time. But there's a lot of work to be done in terms of creative messaging and in terms of that nuance of realizing all of this stuff is connected. You know, militarization is connected, dehumanization and othering of people is connected, and we will get free together from all of these things, and we have to commit to working together towards that. I think there are many pieces in the puzzle that we have to contribute to. I didn't mention before, but there's one other thing that if you haven't done it yet this week, we've made it really easy on the ICANN Australia website. Just at the top, there's like a banner with like 3 things that go past, and one of them is a button you can press, which makes it super easy to link to send messages to both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister to say that we'd like Australia to sign and ratify the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So that's just a quick thing you can do, and it's also something you can ask another person to do, perhaps someone who just wants to do something out of frustration. It's a quick task that, and I find that action drives away despair. So that's an action you can do today if you haven't done that. If you haven't annoyed them about that particular topic this particular week, there's something you can do.
Okay, thank you. Natasha. Oh, sorry.
Well, basically, John said what I wanted to say, so I'll just add to it. I'm more interested in the humane aspect of nuclear weapons. So much is focused on technology. I mean, the photos that I've seen here. But you know what? I don't need the details. I'm not a technological-minded person. But it's enough to see one of them. For many of my friends, they see one of them and they say, it is ridiculous. We don't need to know the details of it. Lots of people, women particularly, they're interested in people, with what's going on in the family, in the friends, and maybe also on the other side of the world, like the bridge walk showed. There's so many people turn up, but the details of it is not, it's only for those who are really interested. I came here to listen what more is for people like me. I'm not alone, but here I feel alone. Everybody understands those things. I am not that kind of activist. But it depends how we connect with our other friends. Do we have other friends that are not not activists. I think this is a kind of disease. That what I see in Australia, that people are in a certain bubble, however worthy it is, but mixed only. It's a kind of like a religion. Yesterday, I went to one religious group. I am new there, and no one mentioned Nagasaki Day, because they are all into peace and everything is beautiful and how we are doing it well. And I feel disempowered with this. So how to get, I don't know, everybody, we need to reach out to those who are others. Otherwise, every bubble by themselves to themselves. There's a sport, national religion of Australia. As I see, sport, and there is issues of trafficking and so many other issues, but we need to kind of get across to different issues and see what's the most pressing. Yeah, so Ruth, please, yeah.
I think it's a really important point that people need to feel the human side of this. That's partly why I mentioned the children's memorial, because it is very much that human side. And as a surgeon, I'm always interested on finding out what's the human experience of being in war, and what's the human experience of being a survivor or a victim of that. And I've moved away in recent years from putting up gory photographs of, the children with the burns and the creases of their arms from the radioactive dust that fell on the Marshall Islands, or the burns on the back of the man from Nagasaki. But we have all of that archive. We have all of that witness. And those bodies tell the story, a very human story, of what these weapons do. And we have to find ways that are honorable and respectful to tell those stories, and hold that memory. Because I think that's something which, certainly your question is a great one. Like, what do we do about those friends of ours that aren't activists? How do we activate them? And in my world, showing people the medical impacts of nuclear weapons can be a way of getting doctors off their bottoms. So in each of your circles, there'll be things that you'll realize, hang on, this is quite motivating. Oh, this is a medical issue. This is a health issue. Oh, okay, now I care. Helping people to see that it's within their purview, that it is in their wheelhouse. It is their lane to advocate for a world free of nuclear weapons.
Sorry, if I think it was 2 or 3 days ago, the Israelis killed the captain of the Palestine soccer team. So those people who are concerned about sport, you can tell them that. All right, sorry, Natasha. Oh, sorry. You're right, Natasha.
Yeah, I was just going to say to the gentleman who said this auditorium had 250 teachers in it yesterday. We have State Council 8 times a year, and one of them was here yesterday. This is the Teachers Federation building, and they heard Jem Rummeld from ICANN talk, and she passed around the Peace Prize, the medal, and she put the QR code up on that screen, and people got out their phones and sent a letter to the Prime Minister, and they all found out how they can take the link on the ICANN website to send, to pass a motion in the associations across New South Wales to write a letter to the local council as that part of the campaign. So I would argue that big and strong unions are doing things. We have association peace contacts in all our associations. They have professional learning they can attend to learn things about what's going on in peace, and good messaging that educates people is important. The Federation officers have been at the last 80 rallies in Sydney on Gaza, and we had a big contingent across the Harbour Bridge. So all I'm saying is that the Teachers Federation is a public education union. Nurses is a public union. Just to come back to unions, I think that's a thing. My worry is not about the teachers, because our employer are governments. So we're used to taking on governments because they give us our jobs and they screw us over and we battle them to take them on. Nurses do a similar thing, My worry is the proportion of the population who aren't in unions. So when the Vietnam War was on, 50% of the population was unionised. Now it's about 14%. The other part of that, which is why I asked my question before, is also, you know, governments, when you went to the polling booth, you used to be voting for your health system, your education system, all your roads and infrastructure, because governments had departments of public works, etc., and you were voting for them to serve the population. And a lot of that work is now privatised. So when you look at Bisalloy down in Wollongong, what my worry is, you've got a fully unionised shop there, and there's 3 different unions who do the work of Bisalloy, and a picket who are fighting people who are just fighting for their jobs. So that's my issue is, when you privatise industries, you take the relationship between the worker, the people who are not in the room you're talking about at the moment, I'm assuming, and the government away, which is one of the symptoms of why we are where we are, I suppose, in my mind, because unions can hold a collective power over their employees, or attempt to take them on like that. Community groups and all that also matters, but that's where you would get major shift, I would think. So I think that one thing everyone can do is to go and say to people they work with, or people in their families, are you a member of your union, and what is your union doing about this, the genocide here and nuclear weapons, etc., because that's my concern around that. And I might just say something gendered here as well. Teaching and nursing are feminised industries. Metal workers is not a feminised industry. Metal workers make things that go to some of the weaponry, for example. So I don't know, there's quite a lot of thinking to do about how we make it right and okay for male union members to do something about this, and at the same time provide for their families. Sorry, that was a statement.
Woohoo!
This will have to be the last
This
one,
is
sorry. Okay. Fabio?
Sort of a question and a comment.
Put the mic
is that,
close to your mouth.
I'm wondering, you know, how come that, you know, I agree with people here, so few people here today. And, you know, we have to actually be more engaged on connecting with other groups. Like when we do something like today, for example, is to have somebody here from the Palestinian groups talking about these issues. And they can understand what our issue about the nuclear situation is, and also we understand their issues. And this goes for many other issues. We're talking about environment, you know. We go to meeting where we're discussing what's happening in Piliga with Santos, and there is same story, 4 people there. Where is all the rest of the people? All these unions, and I totally agree, the union, wherever the women workers or men workers, all these unions, they should be together. You know, I come to the event here in the past, showing a film about environment, and there was nobody here. It was a union that actually sponsored the film, and there was nobody else from other unions. I mean, what's going on in this country? I just don't get it. The other problem that we got in this country is this 2-party system. It's completely wrong, and the people that they continually convinced that the Labour Party is going to be the solution. Now, I'm asking you people, how are we going to change all this situation?
I was thinking we could get Vince to be Prime Minister. That was my suggestion. I think there was just one, there was a hand up at the back there.
Mark. Teachers Federation member. Can't shut them up.
God bless the Teachers Federation.
Thanks to the panel. Look, I guess it's a fairly practical question about the 15th of the month thing. Not about the one in 5 days, but the one in 35, 36 days on September, because the idea was floated at the Stop AUKUS meeting in Marrickville a couple of weeks ago to actually have a public demonstration on the anniversary of Morrison's announcement on the 15th. And taking the point of the previous person who spoke, if that is agreed, we should be publicising that at the next big Gaza rally on the 24th. And, you know, possibly even approaching PAG to see if someone from Stock AUKUS could be on the platform or something like that, just to cross-fertilise a little bit. I think it needs to happen a bit more. So I don't know where that idea is at. One of the speakers in Marrickville was this Chinese professor from UTS, and I had a chat to her. I'm kind of okay with Mandarin. We talked about we should have campaign stalls in like Ashfield and Hurstville and Chatswood and, you know, all those suburbs where there's lots and lots of people of Chinese background and in translated material. So I think there's a lot we can do to try and build this. Yes, we're a small thing today, but, you know, I think we need to work out ways and tap into what's obviously the most dominant movement at the moment for good reason, but there are such obvious connections to be made. You know, 95, we had huge Hiroshima Day protests when the French were testing in the Pacific. You know, Israel's a nuclear power. I think there's an obvious connection that can be made between what we're talking about here and what's being talked about at Hyde Park every week.
Thanks very much, Mark. Look, we'll have to wrap it up there. Look, we have Mr. AUKUS just here, and he's taken that down, that message about the 15th of September. I was invited last. Well, the Palestine group did allow me to speak to the crowd last year. I didn't do it this year. It's just been such a crazy year. Anyway, so they did the right thing last year, and then I thought with all that starvation stuff, I felt a bit sort of hesitant about elbowing in on them. So anyway, maybe I was right, maybe I was wrong. Look, we have an exhibition going on in the atrium of the town hall, of the trades hall. There's a couple of pieces from the exhibition. I love that reddish coloured one, which says at the bottom in English, the bit in English, they have nothing but guns. We've got nothing but each other. And I think that's a lovely piece of art there. But there's other art there in that exhibition. So if you go in there during office hours, and have a quiet reflection, I'm sure you will enjoy it. And so thank you. And if you want to be on the committee, and you're on YouTube, I was hinting at the fact that the Hiroshima Day committee is on the elderly side. So if anyone wants to elbow us out of the way, we'd be more than happy to be elbowed out of the way. And I'd like to thank Faraz and the Muslim Collective. I'm sorry we didn't have enough time to give him a bit of a go at this mic, but he's got a website. The website's called Muslim Collective. And so if you're interested in that, please go to that and follow up. So the two groups have been working together on this event, and I'm very happy with it. But I think we have to get out of here as quick as we can. And so thank you everyone for being here, and all the best. And we've got to draw the raffle. We need. Would ask Angela to draw the raffle?